800キロの爆弾を抱えて飛び出しまして、血の気が引くような思いをしましたから。
Explosions rocked the Pacific during World War II. The kamikaze pilots, willing to give their all for their country, became symbols of unwavering devotion. But beyond the fiery crashes and the propaganda, there's a deeper, more complex story to be told. Join us as we delve into the untold truths about kamikaze pilots, uncovering facts you probably didn't know. The divine wind. Have you ever wondered what kamikaze actually means? It's not just a fancy word for a suicide pilot. In fact, kamikaze literally translates to divine wind in Japanese. Kami, meaning God or spirit, and kaze, meaning wind. And there's a pretty interesting story behind that. Way back in the 13th century, Japan was facing a serious threat from Mongol invasion fleets. Things were looking pretty grim for the Japanese, but then something incredible happened. A massive typhoon swept through the area, decimating the Mongol ships and saving Japan from almost certain defeat. The Japanese believed this typhoon was a gift from the gods, a divine wind sent to protect their nation. And that's where the term kamikaze comes from. Fast forward to World War II, and the Japanese once again found themselves in a tough spot. They decided to resurrect the idea of the divine wind, but this time in the form of suicide pilots. The idea was that these brave young men would become the new divine wind, sacrificing their lives to protect Japan from the Allied forces. It was a desperate tactic, but one that the Japanese believed could turn the tide of the war. The last resort. Japan was in a pretty desperate situation by the end of World War II. They were losing ships and planes faster than they could replace them, and they needed a way to even the odds against the Allied forces. That's where the kamikaze missions came in. The idea was to use suicide pilots to take out as many Allied ships as possible, hopefully depleting their naval forces enough for Japan to regroup and strike back. But here's the thing. It was a total last resort. The Japanese weren't thrilled about the idea of sending their young men on one-way missions. They knew it was a desperate tactic, but felt they had no other choice. In the end, the kamikaze missions weren't enough to turn the tide of the war, but they did cause significant damage to the Allied forces, and they left a lasting impact on the way we think about warfare and sacrifice. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The kamikaze missions might have been a last resort, but they didn't just come out of nowhere. In fact, the idea can be traced back to a specific event in World War II, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This massive naval battle took place in June 1944, and it was a total disaster for the Japanese. They lost a staggering 75% of their Zeke fighter planes, leaving their fleet vulnerable and exposed. The loss was a huge blow to Japanese morale, and it left their military leaders scrambling for a way to strike back. That's when a man named Motoharu Okamura, a naval captain, came up with a wild idea. What if they used suicide pilots to take out Allied ships? At first, the idea was met with skepticism. But Okamura was persistent, and he managed to convince his superiors to give it a shot. And thus, the kamikaze unit was born. It was a controversial move, to say the least. But for Okamura and his fellow officers, it was a matter of honor and patriotism. They believed that the kamikaze missions could be the key to saving Japan from total defeat, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives in the process. The shame game. So how did the Japanese military convince young men to sign up for what was essentially a suicide mission? The answer is simple: shame. In Japanese culture, shame is a powerful motivator. It's not just about personal embarrassment. It's about bringing dishonor to your family and your country. And that's exactly what the military used to pressure young pilots into volunteering for kamikaze missions. If a pilot refused to volunteer, he would be seen as a coward and a traitor. His family would be shunned and disgraced. In a society where honor and loyalty were everything, that was a fate worse than death. But it wasn't just about avoiding shame. Some pilots truly believed in the cause and were willing to sacrifice their lives for their country. Others felt like they had no choice, like they were being forced into it against their will. The truth is, the motivations of kamikaze pilots were complex and varied. Some were driven by patriotism, others by fear, and still others by a sense of duty to their families and their nation. But one thing is clear: The decision to become a kamikaze pilot was never an easy one. The first mission. The first official kamikaze mission took place on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was a pivotal moment in the war, and one that would go down in history as one of the biggest naval battles of all time. The man chosen to lead the mission was a young pilot named Yukio Seki. At just 23, Seki was already one of Japan's most skilled and respected pilots. And when he was tapped to become a kamikaze, he knew exactly what was being asked of him. Seki and his fellow pilots took to the skies in a formation of 24 planes. Their target was the American fleet, which was anchored off the coast of the Philippines. And as they flew towards their destiny, they knew that they were about to make history. The attack was devastating. Seki and his men managed to sink the USS St. Lo, an American aircraft carrier, and damage several other ships in the process. It was a shocking blow to the Allied forces, and one that would have a profound impact on the course of the war. But it came at a terrible cost. All 24 of the kamikaze pilots, including Seki himself, were killed in the attack. They had given their lives for their country, and in doing so, they had become the first of many to embark on what would become one of the most infamous tactics of World War II, the cherry blossom. As the war dragged on and Japan became increasingly desperate, they began to develop new and more sophisticated weapons to use against the Allies. One of the most notorious of these was the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, also known as the cherry blossom. The Oka was essentially a human-guided rocket designed specifically for kamikaze attacks. It was a small, streamlined aircraft, measuring just over 19 feet long and weighing around 4,700 pounds. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in sheer destructive power. The Oka was carried aloft by a larger bomber, usually a Mitsubishi G4M Betty. Once the bomber reached its target, the Oka would be released, and the pilot would glide it towards the enemy ship. At the last moment, the pilot would fire the Oka's 3 solid-fuel rocket engines, propelling the aircraft to speeds of over 576 miles per hour. The impact of an Oka hitting a ship was devastating. The aircraft was packed with over 1,200 pounds of explosives, and its reinforced nose cone allowed it to penetrate deep into a ship's hull before detonating. Even if the Oka didn't sink the ship outright, the damage it caused could be catastrophic. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Oka was the fact that it was essentially a coffin for its pilot. There was no way to escape the aircraft once it had been launched, and the pilot's only mission was to guide the Oka to its target and die in the process. In a grim nod to this fact, each Oka was equipped with a place to store a samurai sword, a symbol of the pilot's willingness to die for his country. The naval kamikazes. The kamikaze missions are often associated with aerial attacks, but the Japanese naval forces had their own version of these human bomb tactics. As the Allies closed in on the Japanese mainland, the Imperial Navy resorted to desperate measures to defend against the anticipated invasion. Two of the most chilling examples were the Shinyo motorboats and the Fukuryu divers. The Shinyo boats were small, wooden motorboats, typically around 18 feet long, that were laden with explosives. These boats were designed to be piloted by a single kamikaze sailor who would aim the vessel at an enemy ship and ram into it at high speed. Upon impact, the boat would detonate, creating a massive explosion that could potentially sink the target ship and kill its crew. Just like the kamikaze pilots, the Shinyo boat pilots were expected to sacrifice their lives in the process. However, the Japanese Navy didn't stop there. They also employed Fukuryu divers, also known as human naval mines. These were specially trained divers who would strap explosives to their bodies and swim out to enemy ships. Once they reached their target, they would detonate the explosives, hoping to take the ship down with them. This tactic was a last resort, born out of sheer desperation, as the Japanese sought to halt the Allied advance by any means necessary. The last kamikaze. As the war drew to a close in August 1945, the Japanese military found itself in a state of disarray. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had dealt a devastating blow to the country's morale, and many soldiers and civilians alike were beginning to question the wisdom of continuing the fight. One man who refused to give up, however, was Admiral Matome Ugaki, the commander of the kamikaze units in the final months of the war. Ugaki was a true believer in the kamikaze cause, and he saw it as his duty to continue the fight until the very end. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that stunned the nation. For Ugaki, the news was a bitter pill to swallow. He had lost countless men under his command, and the thought of surrendering to the enemy was almost too much to bear. In a final act of defiance, Ugaki decided to lead a kamikaze mission himself. He gathered together a group of 11 pilots and their planes and set off toward the American fleet, determined to strike one last blow for his country. Ugaki's plane never reached its target. It was intercepted by American fighters and shot down, and Ugaki himself was lost without a trace. The story of Ugaki's final mission has become a legend in Japan, a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice that so many young men were willing to make for their country. While the kamikaze campaign may have been a military failure, it remains a powerful example of the lengths that people will go to in defense of their beliefs and their way of life. The Battle of Okinawa. Of all the battles fought during World War II, few were as brutal as the Battle of Okinawa. Codenamed Operation Iceberg by the Allies, the battle was a massive amphibious assault on the Japanese island of Okinawa, which was seen as a key strategic stepping stone on the path to an invasion of the Japanese mainland. The battle began on April 1, 1945, with a massive Allied bombardment of the island. American troops quickly established a beachhead and began pushing inland, but they soon encountered fierce resistance from the Japanese defenders. Over the next 82 days, the two sides fought a savage battle across the length and breadth of the island. The Japanese, who were heavily outnumbered and outgunned, employed every tactic at their disposal to slow the American advance, from kamikaze attacks to human wave assaults and guerrilla-style hit-and-run raids. The kamikaze attacks were particularly devastating during the Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese deployed a staggering 1,900 kamikaze pilots during the course of the battle, more than in any other engagement of the war. These pilots wreaked havoc on the American fleet, sinking dozens of ships and killing thousands of sailors. Despite the ferocity of the Japanese resistance, however, the American advance was inexorable. By June 22, 1945, the island had been declared secure, but the cost had been staggering. More than 12,000 American soldiers had been killed, and another 36,000 wounded. The Japanese, meanwhile, suffered even greater losses, with an estimated 100,000 soldiers and civilians killed during the course of the battle. The human torpedo. The Oka wasn't the only kamikaze weapon that the Japanese developed during World War II. Another was the Chiton, a manned torpedo that was essentially a suicide submarine. The Chiton was a cylindrical vessel, measuring around 54 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. It was powered by a single propeller and carried a payload of over 3,000 pounds of explosives. But what made the Chiton truly unique was the fact that it was piloted by a single crew member, who would guide the torpedo to its target and detonate it on impact. Chiton pilots were expected to navigate their vessels using a simple periscope, a stopwatch, and a compass. Once they had located their target, they would set a timer and aim the Chiton towards the enemy ship, knowing full well that they would be killed in the resulting explosion. The Chiton was an incredibly difficult weapon to use effectively, and many of them were sunk before they could even reach their targets. But when they did hit, the results could be devastating. In one infamous attack, a Chiton managed to sink the USS Mississiniwa, a massive oil tanker that was anchored off the coast of Ulithi Atoll in the Pacific. Despite the potential effectiveness of the Chiton, however, it was never used on a large scale. The Japanese military simply didn't have the resources or the manpower to produce enough of the torpedoes to make a significant impact on the war. And like the Oka, the Chiton was a weapon that required an incredible amount of bravery and sacrifice from its pilots, something that was in increasingly short supply as the war dragged on. The kamikaze blunder. The kamikaze attacks were one of the most desperate and ultimately futile tactics employed by the Japanese during World War II. Despite the fearsome reputation of the kamikaze pilots and the terror they struck into the hearts of Allied sailors, the actual effectiveness of the kamikaze campaign was minimal at best. Over the course of the war, kamikaze attacks managed to sink just 51 Allied ships, a drop in the bucket compared to the massive armada that the United States and its allies had assembled in the Pacific. In total, around 3,000 American and British sailors lost their lives to kamikaze attacks. A tragic toll, but one that pales in comparison to the staggering losses suffered by the Japanese. The kamikaze campaign was a last-ditch effort by the Japanese to turn the tide of a war that they were rapidly losing. By 1945, Japan had lost most of its experienced pilots and was running dangerously low on fuel and other essential supplies. The kamikaze attacks were a desperate attempt to inflict as much damage as possible on the Allied fleet, but they were ultimately a futile gesture. Japan lost a staggering 1,301 planes and over 3,000 pilots to the kamikaze campaign, a devastating blow to an already crippled war machine. And while the kamikaze attacks may have struck fear into the hearts of Allied sailors, they did little to change the outcome of the war. Japan was eventually forced to surrender in August 1945, bringing an end to one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, the father of the kamikaze. The idea of using suicide attacks as a military tactic was not a new one, but it was a Japanese admiral named Masafumi Arima who was credited with turning the concept into a reality during World War II. Arima was a brilliant tactician and a dedicated military man who had risen through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By the time the war broke out in the Pacific, he was serving as the commander of the 26th Air Flotilla, a group of elite pilots tasked with defending the Japanese homeland. As the war dragged on and Japan's fortunes began to wane, Arima became increasingly convinced that the only way to turn the tide was to employ suicide tactics against the Allied fleet. In October 1944, he decided to put his money where his mouth was and personally led a group of pilots on a kamikaze mission against the USS Franklin, an American aircraft carrier. Arima's plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed into the sea before it could reach its target, but the die had been cast. Other Japanese commanders took up the idea of kamikaze attacks, and soon the skies over the Pacific were filled with the desperate cries of young men plunging to their deaths in a last-ditch effort to defend their homeland. Despite the failure of his own mission, Arima's legacy as the father of the kamikaze lived on. He was posthumously promoted to the rank of vice admiral and became a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice that the Japanese people were willing to make for their emperor and their country. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. Kamikaze was all about young men sacrificing their lives for their country, but not all kamikaze missions were successful, and some pilots actually made it back alive. So what happened to kamikaze pilots that returned alive? In some cases, pilots who couldn't complete their missions due to mechanical issues or bad weather were given a second chance to prove their loyalty. Takahiko Ena was a kamikaze pilot who was to sacrifice his life on a mission off the coast of Okinawa in 1945. Ena's plane developed engine trouble before he could reach his target, and he was forced to turn back. When he returned to base, he was beaten and shunned by his fellow pilots, who saw him as a disgrace to the kamikaze corps. Although Takahiko Ena's life was spared, other pilots who survived due to weather conditions or technical issues faced harsh consequences. They were often subjected to torture, and in some cases, even execution for their perceived failures, regardless of the circumstances beyond their control. The last ritual. For the young men who were chosen to become kamikaze pilots, the decision to volunteer was often a difficult and deeply personal one. Many were driven by a sense of duty to their country and a desire to protect their families and loved ones from the ravages of war. Others may have been motivated by a desire for glory or a belief in the spiritual rewards that awaited them in the afterlife. Regardless of their reasons for volunteering, all kamikaze pilots underwent a solemn and ritualistic ceremony before embarking on their final mission. The centerpiece of this ceremony was the presentation of a 1,000-stitch sash, a strip of cloth that had been painstakingly sewn together by the women of their village or town. The 1,000-stitch sash was a powerful symbol of the pilot's connection to his community and his willingness to sacrifice everything for their sake. Each stitch represented a prayer or a wish for the pilot's success and safe return, even though everyone knew that there would be no coming back from a kamikaze mission. In addition to the sash, kamikaze pilots also received a white headband known as a hachimaki. The hachimaki was emblazoned with the distinctive red sun of the Japanese flag, a symbol of the pilot's devotion to his country and his emperor. As the pilots prepared to take off on their final mission, They would often wrap the 1,000-stitch sash around their wrist or tie it to their plane as a reminder of the love and support of their families and communities. The Hachimaki, meanwhile, served as a visible symbol of their status as kamikaze pilots and their willingness to die for their country. The Baka bomb. Despite the fearsome reputation of the Oka, Allied pilots soon came up with a nickname for the aircraft that was anything but flattering. They called it the Baka bomb, using the Japanese word for idiot or stupid. The name was a reference to the fact that while the Oka was a formidable weapon, it was also an incredibly foolish one from a tactical standpoint. The slow speed and lack of maneuverability of the Oka made it an easy target for Allied fighters and anti-aircraft guns. But the Allies' dismissive attitude towards the Oka belied the very real psychological impact that the aircraft had on their forces. The idea that the Japanese were willing to sacrifice their own lives in such a way was deeply unsettling to many Allied servicemen, and the specter of the Oka lingered long after the war was over. In a way, the Oka was the ultimate embodiment of the kamikaze spirit, a weapon that was as much a symbol as it was a practical tool of war. And while it may have been a stupid weapon in the eyes of the Allies, there's no denying the bravery and dedication of the pilots who flew it to their deaths. The psychological warfare. Imagine being a gunner on an Allied ship during World War II. You're already on edge, knowing that at any moment you could be attacked by the enemy. But then, you spot something on the horizon, a Japanese plane, headed straight for your ship. And it's not just any plane, it's a kamikaze. The psychological stress of facing a kamikaze attack was immense. These pilots were essentially human-guided missiles, hell-bent on destroying your ship and killing as many of your crewmates as possible. And as a gunner, it was your job to try and shoot them down before they could reach their target. But it wasn't easy. Kamikaze pilots were trained to fly erratically, making them difficult to hit. And even if you did manage to shoot one down, there was always the fear that another one was right behind it. The constant threat of kamikaze attacks took a heavy toll on Allied crews. Many sailors suffered from PTSD and other psychological disorders long after the war was over. And for those who survived a kamikaze attack, the memories of that terrifying experience would stay with them forever. The use of Philippon. The kamikaze mission, long revered as the ultimate sacrifice for the country and a reflection of the unyielding samurai spirit, may harbor a hidden secret. Recent revelations suggest that the kamikaze pilots may have had a little extra help in carrying out their deadly missions. According to some unconfirmed theories, that secret weapon may have been a potent methamphetamine called Philippon. Invented in Japan way back in 1983, Philippon was a powerful stimulant that could provide a surge of energy, heightened focus, and a feeling of invincibility. All qualities that would have been incredibly useful for a pilot on a suicide mission. By giving the kamikaze pilots high doses of Philippon before their final flights, their handlers could have helped them overcome any natural fear or hesitation in the face of almost certain death. The drug would have made them feel unstoppable, allowing them to carry out their missions with a level of determination and aggression that is hard to imagine. Of course, the use of drugs in warfare is nothing new. From alcohol to cocaine, soldiers have long relied on chemical encouragement to help them cope with the horrors of the battlefield. But the idea of using methamphetamines to turn pilots into human missiles is particularly disturbing, even by the standards of World War II. The kamikaze debate: fanaticism or Bushido? The kamikaze attacks have left a complicated and controversial legacy that continues to spark debate and strong emotions to this day. On one side are those who see the kamikaze missions as the ultimate expression of fanaticism and inhumanity, a tragic waste of young lives in the service of a misguided cause. They condemn the attacks as a brutal tactic that caused immense suffering and did little to change the ultimate outcome of the war. But others view the kamikaze pilots through a different lens, one shaped by the ancient Bushido code of the samurai. To them, the decision to sacrifice one's life in service to the emperor and the nation was the highest embodiment of honor, loyalty, and selflessness. They see the kamikaze as heroes who willingly gave up everything for a cause greater than themselves, and whose actions, while devastating, deserve a measure of respect and even admiration. Like so many aspects of war, the truth about the kamikaze likely lies somewhere in between these two extremes. But what is clear is that their legacy, for better or for worse, continues to loom large in the cultural memory of Japan and the world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.